So today on the podcast, I have one of those episodes that I've slowly pieced together over many months. I started working on this project last fall based on a set of observations I had both at Disneyland and Disney World. Simply, I believed I saw more solo travelers to both resorts after the pandemic, and not just a few here and there, but a significant number. When I go to the park, sometimes I go with family, sometimes I go with friends, or sometimes I meet them there, but also I visit the parks by myself very often. Here's the observation that set me jumping down this particular rabbit hole. Starting in 2021, I started noticing other single diners in table service restaurants. Before the pandemic, if I was having a solo meal at a table service restaurant, I was almost always the only solo diner there. After the pandemic, I started to see far more solo diners in table service restaurants. At first, I thought that these were people who perhaps were still a little uncomfortable traveling with others. At this point, masks were still required indoors at the California parks. In Florida, at this point, masks, though not required, were still fairly common at the theme parks, and I didn't really think that much about it. But in the 2 years that followed, as masks mostly went away, and as the world largely went back to normal, I continued to see a far larger number of solo diners in Disney restaurants than I had pre-pandemic. Early in 2023, I attempted to quantify this as best I could. During some visits, I spent time, typically about 45 minutes at the entrance, counting traveling groups. How many people entered the turn or tap styles as a single party versus how many people came as part of a larger group. I had no pre-pandemic data, so I had nothing to compare this to. Also, I realized that there's a limitation here with my methodology. It's possible that a person entering the front gates solo may be meeting up with friends later inside the park. But I'm really sure that Disney did not want me asking every single solo guest if they were meeting a friend later. So I acknowledge that there's a minor limitation here. Still, I wanted to see how all of this was playing out on both coasts. I should point out that all of these samples are from non-holiday periods. I suspect that holiday periods would likely inflate the number of solo visitors, largely with locals who, having the day off from work, wanted to drop by a park for a few hours. These are also all weekday numbers, so they should privilege periods where both coasts have more traditional tourism. And here's where things get a little interesting. The California numbers panned out pretty much as I thought they would. On my tally sheets, I counted traveling groups, not so much individual people. So if a party of 5 came through the gates, I marked down a 1 in the multi-person category. If a party of 2 came through, I marked down 1 in the couples category. If a single person came through, I marked down 1 in the solo category. So I was focused on groups rather than individual people. In California, in both parks, just over 16% of groups coming through the gates were solo visitors, or at least they came through the gates by themselves. Remember, this is traveling groups, not individuals. So 16.3% of groups entering the front gates consisted of one person. This would mean that about 5.5% of individual guests in the park were solo travelers. But this is what I was seeing in restaurants, and why this change was so noticeable there. Think of this in terms of restaurant tables. A traveling group would request 1 table for the whole party, typically regardless of size. A party of 6 would request 1 table, a party of 2 would request 1 table, and a party of 1 would request 1 table as well. So even though only 5.5% of individual visitors were there for a solo visit, this trend becomes very noticeable in terms of restaurants, where parties request 1 table for the entire group, even if that group is just 1 person. So if solo travelers were making dining reservations at the same rate as parties with multiple people, this would mean that over 16% of tables should be taken up by solo visitors. Anecdotally, I'm pretty sure that the actual percentage is far lower than this, as I think solo visitors are more inclined to get a quick bite at a counter service restaurant than to sit down for a table service meal. But I was convinced that single parties in restaurants was up in a meaningful way, which was noticeable. Next, I put together a similar set of numbers for Florida. And with this, I got results that I wasn't entirely expecting. Did the new Florida numbers match those that I'd already put together for California? Well, yes and no. It depends on which park you look at. And these numbers also revealed how guests tend to use the East Coast parks. First of all, the Magic Kingdom numbers did not match the California numbers by a lot. Again, I'm counting traveling groups. Only 9% of traveling groups to the Magic Kingdom were solo travelers, which was far less than that same figure for Disneyland in California. And that wasn't entirely unexpected, as the Florida resort attracts far more family parties than California. But inside these numbers was something that I didn't expect. Only 18% of traveling groups at the Magic Kingdom were couples. The vast majority, 84%, were traveling groups of 3 or more people, including many multi-generational families. This meant that the Magic Kingdom was bringing in far more families than couples. Nearly everyone in the Magic Kingdom was part of a family or a larger traveling group. But that same day, I went over to Epcot and sat at the entrance for about an hour and checked off the traveling groups coming into that park, which revealed that the types of traveling groups coming to Epcot was significantly different than those that were going to the Magic Kingdom. Whereas the Magic Kingdom had 84% of groups with 3 or more people, Epcot had roughly half that. Just 41% were groups of 3 or more. The most common traveling group at Epcot was couples, whereas the Magic Kingdom couples accounted for only 18% of traveling groups. At Epcot, it was 43%. And the percentage of solo parties was identical to what I was seeing in California, right at 16%. Almost surely this had to do with how locals use the parks. Couples or single visitors are far more likely to head to Epcot than they are to the Magic Kingdom. And this creates a very different vibe between the two parks. Magic Kingdom, I'm fairly sure, has a much higher percentage of traditional tourists on vacation, while Epcot feels a little more like a place that locals might hang out. Anyway, these numbers led me back to my original idea, the one that I had had months earlier, that people were using the parks in new ways after the pandemic. Before COVID, by far the most common visitor, at least in my mind, was a person who came to the park with others to have an experience with family or friends, in which a large part of the draw was to be there together. But after COVID, I saw a rise in a different type of visitor. The person who was not there to have an experience with a group and was simply there to enjoy whatever the parks offered in terms of a unique experience. That is, post-COVID, I was seeing a lot more visitors who said, essentially, I'm not here to have an experience with others. I'm here to have an experience with the parks themselves and with what the parks can give me. And this leads into the larger question for our episode today. What exactly do the parks give us? I do realize that I started working through these issues by looking at solo travelers, as it was clear that the solo visitors were primarily there for those direct park experiences. But the conversation, at least in my mind, has now expanded into something larger. What do the parks give us, whether we're there by ourselves or with one other person, or in a multi-generational family group of 15? How are the parks engineered to affect our mood and outlook? And how effective are these strategies at creating a set of feelings that make the experience of being inside the park feel different than being outside of the park? I've marked today's episode as Volume 1. Next week we'll have the second part, and I expect in 6 or 9 months, as my list of items grows, that I'll put together a Volume 3 or so. But today on the podcast, this question: how are the parks designed and engineered to create a unique felt sense of experiences for those inside the parks? Which is one reason why some loyal visitors return to the parks repeatedly, year after year, or sometimes every few months, as the parks, when they are well designed and operated, offer guests a noticeable shift in the way they feel or their mood, which for many is one center of a pleasurable experience of being inside the parks. So here, let's kick into our discussion, which I've labeled Volume 1. So how do the parks artistically and pleasurably manipulate us as visitors so ideally our mood is lifted and that our overall outlook is better inside the park than when we are, say, at home? Let's start with the entrance. A well-designed park creates an experience where guests pass through a type of doorway or path where they leave the familiar world behind and are presented the highly designed world of a theme park. This may be a portal or a visual gate or an actual path that creates a clear separation from the familiar world around us to the one found in the park. Disneyland in California and the Magic Kingdom in Florida, in terms of this entry sequence, both work the exact same way. Guests enter where they see that floral Mickey display and the train station. Early Imagineer John Hench put it this way: the lushly planted berm identifies and separates the park from the outside world. The entrance is the gateway to playtime. But that entrance courtyard is only the first step in a gradual transition into the park itself. When you're out in front of the train station by that floral Mickey, you can still see the outside world. In California, you can see a line of structures just beyond the Disney property, mostly hotels. And in Florida, you can see watercraft, the monorail, the Poly, and the Grand Floridian. From the entrance courtyard, you walk into one of 2 short tunnels that lead beneath the train station. Designers today might call these portals. A portal is a doorway in which guests move from one themed area to the next. But in Walt's time, designers didn't use the term portal. It was simply a passageway to bring guests from one area of an experience into another. And after you move through the tunnel, passing beneath the train tracks and Main Street Station, you would find yourself in Town Square. There you can only see the turn-of-the-century town. At this point, the train station built on top of the berm works as a visual screen so you can no longer easily see outside of the park. No longer can you see the monorail or the boats or the distant hotels. The train station and the buildings around Main Street and Town Square focus your attention on this one themed area, which is unified to the design of the early 20th century. At this point, standing at the edge of Town Square, you're unable to see the castle. It's only when you step to the center of Town Square, or more likely out onto Main Street, that you finally see the castle. And that gray and blue structure with its rising turrets becomes the point of interest that draws you down Main Street toward it. In this, the design of the park manages how you experience it, with the real world fading away in stages. At first, when you enter the tap stiles or turnstiles, you can see the hotels and transportation that exists just outside of the park. But then you see something that looks familiar, a small town with buildings that were likely constructed 100 or so years ago. This is the first step into a controlled world of fantasy. And then once you're visually acclimated to this change, inhabiting a town constructed many years ago, you move toward another visual signpost with the appearance of the castle, something that doesn't belong in turn-of-the-century America. The park is announcing that you are in a fantasy kingdom, where the world of turn-of-the-century America transitions into the fanciful world of fairy tales. And visually, this is another step that the park is inviting you to take away from the world of school, business, or work that you know from outside of its gates. John Hench also used to explain that a well-designed park removed the visual clutter found in American cities. Typically, businesses along a downtown street would create signs to attract the interest of passersby. These signs created a system whereby businesses competed for the fleeting interest of potential customers. Hench would have called this a type of visual clutter, in which each sign works only in the interest of one business and doesn't create a unified vision or a sense of order. Add into this, each business, shop, or restaurant may have its own sense of design. A travel agency that offers trips to Hawaii may have its windows dressed with images of surf and the beach. Next door, a Thai restaurant may dress its windows with images of Thai dishes or the Thai flag or images of the Garuda, Thailand's royal symbol. And next to that might be a store that specializes in computer repair, which dresses its windows with a list of monthly specials. John Hench would have referred to this as a lack of visual unity, messages that don't go together, leaving visitors to sort it all out for themselves. He also believed that this type of endless advertising, signs that competed for your attention, caused a slight elevation of anxiety, in that this type of retail neighborhood didn't have a unified message, and through competing signs and images, created an experience of chaos and confusion for those walking down the streets. Beyond this, retail sections of a downtown street might have alleys or poorly lighted alcoves that suggest the possibility of danger lurking just behind the shadows. The experience of being inside of a well-designed theme park, at least according to John Hench, is the exact opposite of this. A well-organized park presents a unified message and a unified design. It reduces visual clutter, such as endless signs. It creates comfort by developing an environment that easily directs guests how to use it. It also removes the visual suggestions of possible danger, unless those are elements necessary for an attraction or an in-park dramatic presentation. Hench believed that design and order and a sense of visual safety lowered anxiety in guests as they engaged an environment that was easy to understand and navigate. The better designed Disney parks have these elements around their entrance. The entrance to Epcot is a path that leads you beneath Spaceship Earth, and once you are on the other side of that massive geosphere, the structure works as a visual screen, so you can no longer see the parking lot, the security stations, and whatever else lies outside of the park. Animal Kingdom has an entry path called the Oasis that slowly immerses you into nature, again guiding you away from the world outside of the park. The Oasis is a buffer zone that allows you to slowly transition from the familiar world outside of the park to the one that is inside of Animal Kingdom. And once you've made your way through the Oasis, similar to that walk beneath the train station on Main Street to Town Square, you can finally see the park's fantasy icon, in this case, the Tree of Life. And that there is a well-designed entrance. The American resorts also have two parks that don't present this transition well, one in Florida and one in California. They are both Eisner-era parks that were built with a limited budget, and the company has since spent billions of dollars trying to undo some of the initial design choices for each of these parks. In California, it's DCA, and Florida, it's Hollywood Studios, and they both work the exact same way. You step beneath the Pan-Pacific architecture of its turnstile area, and you're immediately on a historic recreation of a California retail street. In California, the street is tied to the 1920s. In Florida, it's a little later, the 1930s. But there's no meaningful transition path or portal area, no set of strong visual screens. You simply walk into the park, and even as you're on either Hollywood Boulevard in Florida or Buena Vista Street in California, you can easily see outside of the park. I should point this out, though, that Hollywood Studios does have one of the best designed transition or portal areas of any Disney park. It's just not at the park entrance. And this is that fabulous entrance path from the Grand Avenue section of the park by Muppet Vision 3D into Galaxy's Edge. The Disney parks are a series of transition areas or portals moving guests from one themed area to the next. And this one works extremely well. The path is a tall, slightly curved tunnel. From the Grand Avenue side, you can't see over into Galaxy's Edge, and from Galaxy's Edge, you can't see over into Grand Avenue. The tunnel provides a visual break as you leave one area, as well as enough space so that you spend a reasonable amount of time in that tunnel to allow you to refocus your attention on the theme of the land just ahead. And this might be the first set of elements that theme parks give us as visitors. Visual screens that block out the outside world, a well-designed environment inside the park that's free of confusion, excess signage, and the suggestion of danger, and a sense that the environment around us has been specifically designed to engage our interest, our curiosity, and this is the first thing that we typically don't see outside of the parks. The next couple areas that we'll take a look at concern the social rules for the Disney theme parks. In general, when you remove potential dangers from an environment, such as dark alleys or fast cars, you make it easier for adult guests to relax and engage a sense of play. Kids play anywhere, at school, on neighborhood streets, at the local mall. But the parks are one of the few places where I see adults engaged in play in public space. When you enter a Disney park, you regularly see adults with mouse ears or Oswald ears, with character backpacks or pins festooning a lanyard. And this is a clear visual signal that the social rules inside the park are different than the rules back home. And this is something, too, that is not only pertinent to the traditions of the park, but has been engineered and encouraged by the parks. Some of the early festive headwear sold at Disneyland back in the 1950s were those kepi caps decorated with images of the castle and icons from the various themed lands. Then there were those Davy Crockett coonskin caps. And if you click over to either Disneyland or Disney World's websites right now, you'll find photos of guests wearing mouse ears or dressed in Star Wars Jedi robes, or for the California resort carrying Thor's hammer. These photos model how guests can act inside the parks, nudging visitors to dress in a way that encourages a sense of public play, a type of dress that probably would be inappropriate or socially unusual in most environments, such as work outside the parks. The photos on their websites, the TV and online commercials, and various promotions are ways that Disney, as a company, encourages this type of play inside their parks. When they film parades, such as the Christmas parade, which is aired each year on ABC, they arrange the crowd so that many people in front of the cameras have festive hats and other swag. Typically, the on-camera crowd is comprised of cast members, very often members of the college program, and about a half hour before the parade begins, and therefore filming begins, hats and such souvenirs are passed out to the crowd. So again, they model how this type of light costume play works in the parks for people watching at home. I'm also sure it models how people buy these hats, but that's another issue. From visiting the parks regularly for decades, I can tell you that this type of adult play is far more common in Florida than in California. California is largely a locals park, primarily drawing guests from the region, so there's a reasonable chance you might see someone you know from work while on a day trip to the parks. But Florida, for the most part, is a resort filled with traditional tourists from across the country and around the globe. Unless you're from Orlando, there's a far smaller chance you'll see someone you know once you step inside the park. And that lack of being seen, of having to live up to the social identity you've established for yourself back home, further encourages adult guests to participate in the type of dramatic play that often happens inside the parks. During Walt's time, as Walt was building Disneyland, there were clearly two different options as to how guests would use the park once it was open, and this was clear based on what different managers wanted to fund. One group of people, including the park's first president, C.V. Wood, believed that guests at Disneyland would act like an audience at a movie theater. They'd want to be entertained, but wouldn't want to be part of the entertainment themselves. Another group, including Walt Disney, believed that movie-like sets would encourage guests to become part of the entertainment. And to encourage this, Walt hired actors to portray a sheriff, an outlaw, and various deputies in Frontierland, actors who would then take in guests to participate in small dramas that unfolded each day. He also did the same on Main Street, hiring actors to play residents of the town. Ultimately, both of these groups, Walt and C.V. Wood, were right. There are some guests that want to be entertained as though the Magic Kingdom or Disneyland is simply one very large and involved stage play. Yet there are others who want to participate in that play themselves, such as by dressing up in clothes similar to those worn by the Rebels or the First Republic in the Star Wars films. But this second group, those who do want to participate in some type of play or light costuming, has been growing in recent years. And with it, the parks signal that they're a safe place for both adults and kids to engage in some type of light imaginative play that might not be acceptable outside of the park. And this is another element that the parks give people, a place without danger, without judgment to role play, or simply play in public space in a way that might be difficult or awkward to do back home. So the parks are engineered to create a unique social environment in which certain common behavioral codes are lifted to allow people to express themselves in new ways. And this feeds into a related item on my list, another way that the parks engineer a unique social environment. I like to call this the moral temperature of the parks, and this, I suspect, which is something that is not often discussed, is one of the big drivers for repeat visitation, one of the key reasons that people go back to the parks over and over again. Many years ago, the Disney parks had a single moral temperature, but now I think there's a range of moral temperatures inside of the parks, depending on which park and which land you are in. And what do I mean by moral temperature? All environments have a moral temperature. There's an appropriate way to act underscored by a certain set of values, such as when you're at home. Ideally, the moral environment of your home is based on closeness, mutual support, and openness. But the moral temperature of your home may be different than that of the place where you work. Simply, there might be different goals and different ethics in place in your work environment versus your home environment. In part, this has to do with the stories that play out at work compared to those stories that tend to play out at home, and the underlying rules that govern those two places. Work may encourage stories of competition or aggression, or conversely, Work may encourage collaboration or group promotion. Home encourages stories of closeness, support, as well as stories of maturation. But the stories that play out in each environment define its moral temperature. To put it simply, the stories that exist in any location define its moral framework and suggest a set of behavioral ethics that people should adopt when in that space. Maybe an easy way to define this is to compare the parks owned by Disney and those owned by Universal. In some ways, the Universal parks and the Disney parks have become closer in terms of entertainment technology and the creation of immersive environments. Is Cars Land at DCA a better designed space than Hogwarts at Universal? I can see good arguments leaning both ways. Is the Kuka ride system in the Forbidden Journey at Universal a better ride system than the motion base and screen system on Flight of Passage at Disney? Again, I can see arguments leaning both ways, but the Universal parks and the Disney parks, at least in terms of moral temperature, are not interchangeable. Again, the moral temperature of a place is largely defined by the stories or history that reside there. Remember, the stories of what people do at work likely create a different moral temperature than the moral temperature of your home. To put this in terms of the theme parks, the moral temperature of the Disney parks is different than that of the Universal parks, largely because of the stories that reside there. At the Disney parks, you find stories of Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, Toy Story, Monsters Incorporated, Lion King, Jungle Book, and so on. These are stories that value a family-style closeness, a deep level of honesty and vulnerability, the support of friends, and often sacrifice in service to others. Sure, there are villains in these stories, but the narratives are arranged so that the audience identifies with the heroes. The training of frontline cast members also encourages these same attitudes. Cast member training largely is about courtesy and about being other people-centered, again reflecting the moral attitudes encouraged in many Disney films. If you as a guest are in an environment where these stories exist, you'll likely feel environmental nudges that guide your actions closer to those ideals. This is one reason I think why people generally are on good behavior while in the Disney parks, barring any large frustration. What are the stories of the Universal parks, though? Well, there's Harry Potter, but there's also Fast and Furious, Jurassic Park or Jurassic World, Transformers, Revenge of the Mummy, Men in Black, and so on. And the moral temperature of those films is very different than most of the classic films produced by Disney or Pixar. And when you're in a Universal environment, the home stories have a different set of underlying morals that allow for slightly different guest behavior. There's a couple of quick takeaways from all this. When a fight breaks out at Universal, it rarely, if ever, makes the news as the moral environment of, say, Fast and Furious or Jurassic World allows for types of aggression in these stories, even from the heroes. It's unfortunate when this happens, but it never lights up the internet the same way as when something similar happens at Disney. Do fights happen somewhat regularly at Universal? They do. They happen about as often as they happen at Disney. In the past year, one incident at Universal caused a parking garage to close, and another small brawl shut down City Walk. However, when the same thing happens over at Disney, even if no one is injured, it often turns into a viral news story because this type of behavior is so far outside the moral temperature baked into a Disney park. Fantasyland is based on stories that are filled with kindness, mutual respect, growth, and a strong sense of family and community support. Again, this is not to say that these films don't have villains, they do. But these villains are villains because their values don't align with that of their surrounding community. The selfish young prince, for example, at the start of Beauty and the Beast, is told that he must be a beast until he learns the value of love. That is, until his actions and outlook are far closer to that of the surrounding community, which includes Belle, her father, and so on. The town has one ethical center, and the film's villains, to some extent the Beast and surely Gaston, exist outside of that. But when elements of that town are recreated in a Disney park, they bring with them the social values that the town embraced in the film. When you're in that small, unnamed town in France where Belle is from, the environmental cues nudge you to act in a way that most people do in that town. So this past year, when a fight broke out in Fantasyland not far from the Beauty and the Beast section, it seemed wildly out of place, as the environment suggested a different ethical behavioral standard than the one that was then being played out in the park. Conversely, if a fight were to break out over at Universal in front of the Fast and the Furious attraction, it would still be a civic and safety concern, but far less of a branding issue, as the characters in Fast and Furious regularly get into such fights in the films. And here, let me jump in with a side note. This is also one reason that certain fans object to modern additions to the Disney parks. There was a small group of fans that objected to the inclusion of Galaxy's Edge, and a larger group of fans that objected to Avengers Campus at DCA. For the most part, I don't think the objections here were centered on a level of creativity or the sophistication of those narratives. A lot of this boiled down to moral temperature. The values and behavior of the characters in those films are very different than those in a typical Disney or Pixar animated feature, and by including Star Wars and Marvel in the parks, it adjusted the moral center of the stories and characters that lived in this space, and also therefore adjusted the moral temperature of the parks, or at least the sections where those films exist. That fans objected to their inclusion suggested that the core Disney moral temperature is something that fans value. In terms of an overall framework, this is one of the key, often unmentioned experiences that the parks give us. The parks create a space where the public values are slightly different than those of the outside world. The Disney parks are places where stories with an elevated and more simplistic set of values live, and that, I think, nudges people toward their better selves when they are in the parks. There are, of course, exceptions to this, but this, I think, is one of the key elements that draws guests over and over back to the parks, that the stories that exist there encourage guests to act in ways that might be slightly more generous or outgoing or compassionate than they might act at a mall or in a downtown section back home. That is, the parks are public space that have arranged environments that encourage an openness and even connectedness between strangers. I myself am far more likely to have conversations with strangers in the parks than when I go downtown or when I spend an hour at Costco. And this, I'm guessing, is another element that brings guests back to the parks, as there is an engineered environment that encourages good behavior and even brief connections between people who have just met. But these are not the only ways that the parks use environmental cues to alter our mood and outlook when we visit them. I started down this rabbit hole by noticing a substantial uptick in solo visitors to the parks, a group that often includes myself. And then I started to make a list of inviting experiences that guests who are there by themselves receive from the parks. In terms of a company, Disney presents itself as an entity that creates films and TV shows and builds attractions. But at least as I see it, those attractions are not the final product that Disney creates. What Disney actually creates and what it sells are the feelings that we have when we visit the park. The themed lands and the various attractions are only the intermediate step in arriving at the actual product that Disney creates. What Disney ultimately creates are the feelings and moods you experience at the parks or in a theater. That's the product that Disney sells and sells well. And then, of course, while working through my list of experiences, I realized the obvious, that those solo visitors might be a little more focused on what the park directly gives them. These experiences interest nearly all guests, how the space and activities inside the park are going to alter and improve their mood. And perhaps the biggest thing I missed when I jumped into this topic many months ago was this, that family and other large groups are likely interested in how the environment of the parks are not only designed to alter their personal moods and space, but are also designed to improve the space between family or group members. The parks are about a type of pleasurable manipulation in which we as guests engage a system that ideally will elevate, if only temporarily, how we feel about ourselves, about each other, and about the world around us. Next week, we're going to continue this conversation. The way the parks are designed to briefly change us and encourage us to act in unique ways. We'll look at how laughter works in social and private space, how music defines mood, and how mass entertainment experiences encourage visitors to find, if briefly, their identity inside of a much larger group. And these are only some of the ways that the parks, when well designed, create not only unique experiences inside of attractions and shows, but also a unique set of feelings that isn't easily duplicated elsewhere. In Florida, sometimes we talk about this set of feelings extended over many days as being inside of the Disney bubble. But this is all part of the design fabric that allows guests, whether they are there with a group or by themselves, to have unique experiences beyond the rides, where the personal feelings or sensations of being in the park provide slightly elevated pleasures compared to that of being in public space elsewhere in the world. I'll be back next week to continue this discussion about what the parks give us when we visit them. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly subscriber on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.